Yeah. Okay. So those are great questions, and this is really my bread and butter kind of stuff. So the phrase "escalate to de-escalate" itself, there is at the very least an academic debate about whether or not that is even Russian doctrine. So the phrase "escalate to de-escalate" comes from a House Armed Services Committee hearing back in about 2015, I believe it was, where the deputy Secretary of Defense was asked what the Russian Gerasimov doctrine was, and Gerasimov himself is the equivalent of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Russians. The Gerasimov doctrine was a speech that Gerasimov gave about back in about 2012, 2013, in which Gerasimov was describing what he thought American policy was for the Arab Spring. He probably didn't even write the speech himself, in all honesty, but his speech then got pulled into what the Americans described what the Russian policy was, even though Gerasimov was describing American policy. And it kind of just spiraled into this sort of thing where now I believe it was the 2018 nuclear defense review, the Americans claim that the Russian policy is escalate to de-escalate. Now, so that's the
Wait,
academic
so
side of things.
that's not a thing. That's a so escalate to de-escalate is not an official Russian doctrine as you just described it then.
Correct. Yeah, it is a giant game of telephone. In all honesty, and so that's why. But at the same time, though, all militaries, from a strategic perspective, attempt to get the other side to push away from the table at some point, and that's essentially what the policy is attempting to describe. But the reason why this game of telephone happened was because the Deputy Secretary of Defense was asked to briefly summarize the Gerasimov doctrine, and he said it's escalate to de-escalate. It was a quick, easy, kind of sexy way of describing it. It's not a very good way of describing it either, because it implies that the Russians are willing to use nuclear weapons first, and the Russians have been on both sides of that topic. They do not agree with themselves if they're willing to use nuclear weapons first. So it's a very convoluted way of describing Russian policy. But having said that, when it comes to the actual use of nuclear weapons and tactical nukes, as you asked about them, the Russians have very small yield nuclear weapons that could be in the range of half a kiloton of destructive power. Which, for reference, the American nuclear bomb that went off in Hiroshima was about 15 kilotons. So we're talking very small nuclear weapons. It will probably, if it were to go off in the center of Kyiv, for example, a half a kiloton nuclear bomb would probably destroy about maybe 3 blocks worth of area. It's not terribly large on nuclear weapons, from a nuclear weapons perspective, and the radiation from half a kiloton is not going to be traveling too terribly far either. So that becomes then, if you will, if you take it a step further, it becomes more of a temptation for the Russians to use that, because it's so tiny that it could be masked as just a very large conventional bomb. It would take some additional time for the Americans or for the West to verify that it was a nuclear weapon, for example. And once that it's been determined, it's between 3 and 5 days, let's say, sort of thing. And so time goes on, and it becomes a way for the Russians to kind of breach that step of using nuclear weapons, but it's so small. Are the Americans, since they don't have any equivalent of nuclear weapons that small, are the Americans willing to respond in kind with nuclear weapons, which would be far larger? So it becomes a game of deterrence, if you will.
And where would you speculate, knowing what you know about Russian doctrine, or what is out there that actually is real versus how we describe it? Do you think that Russia would use nuclear weapons on the battlefield as an effective tool to try and change the what's going on the battlefield, or do you think they would use it more as a terror weapon in, let's say, some small city to just make a statement, or even out in the middle of nowhere to make a statement that this can go to a city next, or the next city could be Kiev, or what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, and just for perspective, to make things extra complicated, you can accomplish more than one thing at once, especially with regards to nuclear weapons. You can send a message, and you can also take out a military target, for example. One of the reasons why the use of nuclear weapons is such a why it's listed as an unconventional weapon is because it's largely a political. The decision to use nuclear weapons is a political decision. It's very rarely a purely military option, because the way that most militaries are nowadays, most military targets can be destroyed with conventional weapons of one sort or another, even if you have to use multiple ones at the same time. So the use of nuclear weapons and the message that it sends is largely a political one as well. So I think that is really going to come down to what does Mr. Putin want to, what kind of message does he want to send? I think that's really what it's going to come down to. The Russians have what they call red lines, in terms of their nuclear doctrine of what will it take for the Russians to use nuclear weapons. So, for example, if the West were to attack Kaliningrad, the little enclave of Russian territory between Poland, Belarus, and the Baltic countries, that would be what they consider a red line, and that would be a circumstance under which they would use nuclear weapons. And a second one would be if their forces were degraded to such an extent that they can no longer provide a viable defense for the Russian homeland. That's a very murky and gray area, and it really comes down to what is the Russian government willing to do. So the answer to that, to your question, is it's complicated. He probably, if he were backed into a corner, he could very well use. I think it would start off with very small yield nuclear weapons in order to send that message, and then they would go from there.